Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, everybody. This is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. July 1st was supposed to be the day that Israel could annex at least the Jordan Valley, and nothing happened, and it's sort of become kind of quiet on the whole topic. All the future decisions this coalition government will make, breaking with more than half a century of Israeli policy concerning territory captured in the Six-Day War, this decision whether to annex at least the Jordan Valley must surely rank as one of the most fateful. Now, it turns out that, for example, Jordan is warning of instability, and it was a very unusual thing that the Emirati ambassador to the United States published an article in Yediot Achronot in Hebrew, in which he spoke against annexation, and it's the first time a diplomat from the Arab world has published an article in Hebrew in an Israeli newspaper. And we have a problem that there are all kind of people like the Democratic Party in the United States, whose obvious candidate is opposed to our annexing the Jordan Valley. There's no international support for any unilateral Israeli moves. There's no chance of any regional negotiations to implement Trump's deal of the century. And who knows even if Trump will be the U.S. president come November. So this is an extremely difficult time. And Israel's closest friends in Europe, including Germany and Great Britain, have spoken out against annexation. So we have a situation where, except for the Trump administration, which is now tied up in the election, everyone else seems to be against annexation. So should Israel go ahead or not? Should they have the guts that Ben-Gurion did back in 1947? Who knows? I'll speak about this somewhat. It's a sensitive time, and we don't know what's going to happen. It's rather nerve-wracking, but we'll get through somehow. I'll be back after the break.
G'day, I'm Jono Vandor.
And I'm Ross Nichols.
Join us on our program, Israel on My Mind, a show that broadcasts all the weekly goodness that flows like milk and honey from the Holy Land straight into your ears with humorous and happy news stories.
New shows are posted every Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time, highlighting the lighter side and advancing a positive view of Israel here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. As I watch what's happening in the United States, I want to share a personal thought with the listeners. The America that I grew up in and lived in for my formative years apparently no longer exists. I've been living in Israel since 1969, 50 years. But my formative years, until I was educated, married, and had a family, I still lived in the United States. I'm afraid now there is no longer the kind of thing that existed in my time. America, for example, was once a country that respected religion. Today it's become overwhelmingly secular, with all the attendant evils that such a change in society engenders. History teaches us, I believe, that nothing goes on forever and that great countries and empires rise, but inevitably they fall. For many years, I thought that the United States was an exception to that rule, but I'm not sure of that anymore. I think the curve has already flattened, and we are witness to a downward spiral that leads to impotence in world events. I hope that I'm wrong, but I think about it. Even a cursory review of world history allows us to realize that mighty countries and empires fall, not necessarily because of outside pressures, but rather because implosion of the society itself. For example, Rome ruled the world for more than 5 centuries, and at the height of its power, it succumbed to barbaric tribes. The breakup of the empire came as Rome was undermined by the spread of Christianity within its society and the dissatisfaction of social norms. These factors gave way to internal violence and a complete abandonment of any sense of loyalty to the empire itself, or to the history that Rome had so carefully fashioned and preserved over its centuries. Rome collapsed from within and not from without. When you have a society in which this history is not recognized, and its history is not preserved, and its history is not honored, like pulling down statues and so forth, you have a civilization in trouble, big trouble. Look at the Ottoman Empire. It was rotten from the inside, and any stress placed upon it would hasten its extinction. And the stress came because of the First World War. And the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which had been an empire for about 400 years, never recovered. The same can be said of the Spanish Empire back in the 16th century. It never recovered from something that it did foolishly. It kicked out the Jewish population, and it no longer possessed the creativity and the will to succeed that had driven it to become one of the major powers in the world back in the 15th and 16th century. It was the Jewish population that helped it reach its zenith. So now we have to ask ourselves what's going to happen to the United States. I don't want to sound gloomy, by the way. I'm trying to be as objective as possible. The United States today is a very polarized society, and over the past decades it has apparently lost its moral footing. It's become hateful of its own heritage. It's spoiled by perhaps too much material wealth, and is subject, I believe, to Marxist indoctrination from the educational system, from the universities. Many years ago, a political scientist said, if you can control the education system, you control the future. And what's happened, I believe, in the last 30 or 40 years, that the educational system has moved far to the left. So that is a serious problem. There'll be, as time passes, the whether America will have a prosperous future over the next few decades is a difficult question to answer at the moment. It is particularly, and I'm not being political. I think that, if, for example, if the Democrats obtain the presidency at the end of the year in November, there'll be more governmental regulations regarding curricula in a school and the nature of educational classes in schools. This will affect, I believe, private schools as much as public schools. And when I say private schools, I include Jewish parochial schools. For example, education in many parochial schools is separated by sex. It could be that it will no longer be allowed. And perhaps the concentration on studies other than the normal ABCs like Torah studies, will be severely limited. I may be wrong, I don't know, but watching what's happening now, and particularly the tearing down of statues, I don't think that many people realize the implication of tearing down of statues. It's not that you dislike one particular representation of a statue, like a statue of Robert E. Lee, who was the general of the Confederacy back in the Civil War. But these statues are put up to honor people for the contributions they made to society without looking at their personal inclinations. For example, 41 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, 41 out of 56, were slaveholders. They bought and sold human beings. And today, they managed to, they took their lives in their hands to separate the United States from the Great Britain, and it succeeded. The revolution succeeded, and all these people put their lives on the line by signing the Declaration of Independence. The slaveholders, and even perhaps some were anti-Semites, who knows? People are honored for what they do for the society, not for their personal behavior. So the pulling down of statues because of a particular aspect of a person's life, it makes no sense. The statues are there for what they did for society. And when the society no longer recognizes and respects them for what they did, the society is in very big trouble. And that's what bothers me about what's happening now in the United States. And there's something else that these people who pull down statues don't realize. A healthy society is a society that grows and develops. It's not a totalitarian society that doesn't change. For example, until the 22nd or 21st Amendment, I don't remember which one, in 1865, the black persons were not citizens. They had no right to vote. Interestingly enough, black men, got to vote right after the Civil War, and they got to vote actually before white women. Women didn't get to vote until 1920. So a healthy society is one that recognizes its problems and it works to improve itself. I can say the same thing about Israel. When I came to live in Israel 50 years ago, the country was essentially run by the Labor Party. If you didn't belong to the right party, you found it very difficult to get a job. And this is very serious. I remember what it was like when I came. And the country today is totally different, totally more liberal, totally more open, because the people who lived here wanted to make a positive change. And that's what the United States is. It's a perfect example of development over time. From a segregationist society, from a slaveholding society, to the mightiest country in the world that's fought to preserve freedom for everybody. These are the facts. And now you see people who not only are pulling down statues, but there are politicians and people in positions of influence and power who are simply saying that's okay what they're doing. It's not okay what they're doing. And if the leadership doesn't take responsibility and know itself what it's leading, who it's leading, and how it should be leading, the country is in great difficulty. It's not the pulling down of statues that's dangerous. It's the politicians who say that's okay to pull down statues. They're venting their feelings. That's not okay. The problem is not with the people who pull down statues. It's a problem with the people in positions of responsibility who justify it. That is the great danger in the United States, as I see it. That's my own feeling. I wanted to share it with the listeners because right now we're at the height of this problem, and hopefully it'll resolve itself. At the moment, the resolution doesn't seem to be in sight. I don't want to depress the listeners. I just wanted to share my thoughts. I'll be back after the break.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together, we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. The 1st of July was the date when, according to the Trump administration, Israel could go ahead and annex parts of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Now, there is no doubt that Israel's on the verge of making history, declaring independence in May of 1948, liberating Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights in June 1967, applying sovereignty over the Golan Heights in December 1981. All of these things are now part of our history, and now annexing Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, making them finally a legal part of the state of Israel. That's the next step. Some see this as another topic for politicians to clash over, but in fact, this would be one of the most important and courageous steps that Israel's leadership has taken. It's a logical one, by the way. Over half of the 430,000 Israeli citizens now living in the West Bank settlements reside in large blocks. These include Gush Etzion, Ma'ale Adumim, and Ariel. All Zionist politicians, even without saying it out loud, believe that these settlers are not going anywhere, and there is no reason to evacuate them under any peace agreement. But there's no doubt that not only is internal support needed, but also external. It would be nice if the Palestinians would agree, but the past has taught us that such support is impossible. It was tried by several former prime ministers, Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert. He offered the Arabs most of the West Bank. They refused. There's absolutely no real chance that the Arabs will agree to the Trump plan. But not only regional support is important, for years Israel has sought international support and recognition for its claim to Judea and Samaria. Such recognition empowers Israel's decisions, strengthening its international status, and most importantly, it changes reality on the ground. Only someone who lives in a settlement, like I did, knows how things look when construction is allowed and when it's frozen. This has a crucial influence on the economy of the settlers and their families. This time, Israel has the principal green light of its closest ally, the White House. In Trump's plan, which was presented last January, the Americans approved the annexation of the large blocks, even with no Palestinian consent. One of the most vocal supporters of this move is the United States Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. However, it seems when it comes to the annexation now, in the summer of 2020, Israel has only half of the support from its ally overseas. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has expressed his opposition to annexation. In late May, he said that he would not support annexation and added that if he wins, he's going to reverse Trump administration steps, which I think significantly undercut the prospects of peace. That's what he said without even mentioning anything about the left-wingers in his party who support him. In fact, almost the entire Democratic Party expresses discontent from the move. A letter was signed by 60% of the Democratic senators a couple weeks ago. It's about a month ago. It read, "A deep commitment to Israel's security and a shared set of democratic values are foundational elements of the close relationship between our countries. We are therefore concerned that unilateral annexation puts both Israel's security and democracy at risk." So we have sort of a warning from the Democrats. True, we should not allow our actions to be dictated by foreign forces, and we should be free and independent to make our own choices. That is the way we have been acting since the state came into being. As a matter of fact, oftentimes it's not been independent of outside foreign feelings, but it's been against them. So we should not allow our actions to be dictated by foreigners. But this move could have dramatic consequences for Israel, some that are good and some are bad. Bipartisan American support to a move like this is important. We cannot allow a scenario in which in January 2021, the Democrats may be in power, and even if the Democrats don't take power till 4 years later in 2025, a Democratic president enters the White House and could think of reversing such a move. It would not only put Israel in an embarrassing position in front of the world, it may be a devastating blow to Israel's relationship with the United States. Now, Israeli leaders have been extremely wise since the founding of the State of Israel to keep Israel above political conflict in the United States. And by the way, I think one of the reasons was that except for some very minor things, actually I shouldn't say minor, except for certain subjects like economics, for example, the Democrats and the Republicans are either a little bit right of center or a little bit left of center. Today, the Democrats are far, far left of center. The U.S. politics is very polarizing, and it's hard to juggle between both parties. The situation is much more sensitive than it's been for many, many years. As I said, the parties really weren't that much different when it came to a lot of things, but now there's a huge difference in the parties. However, our prime minister, despite his friendship and interest to support the current president, there's no doubt that Bibi is a friend of Trump, which, by the way, could work against us if the Democrats win. But we have to figure out a way to make what we want happen without further polarizing the feelings of the parties in the United States about us. When we hear such strong opposition from the Democratic Party and from the international community, particularly from Europe, the Arab world, of course, that goes without saying, we have to make sure that if and when we do annexation, it's done properly and done right, and that the proper preparations are made diplomatically. If Israel applies sovereignty, it could be in steps. It could be just over Maladumim Gush Etzion or Ariel. It could be the major settlement blocks, but not all the settlements. We don't know yet. Back in January, Netanyahu had a different phased annexation plan. Right after Trump presented his vision for peace, Netanyahu's political spokesman said there'd be a cabinet vote on settlement annexation within a few days. The idea was to hold a vote only on the settlements and a later vote on the full 30%. And the 6 months since the Trump plan came out, this world's response has been overwhelmingly negative toward it, and overwhelmingly negative toward the idea that Israel would annex the settlements. They talk about economic sanctions, and some of Israel's top trading partners, like the European Union, United Kingdom, China, and certainly not the U.S., they're threatening them in a response, economic response. But there are other smaller punitive measures by the European Union and its members that could hurt Israel. Of course, Jordan's King Abdullah has said annexation would cause a massive confrontation with Israel. So it's not war or sanctions, but still a lot of threatening to cool down Israel's international ties. That is a real problem. So maybe partial sovereignty would be better, be less of a risk. And politically, it wouldn't give the Likud or Netanyahu many points. But the question is, without doing anything at all for the next few months, the Likud could certainly lose its right wing. So there's a lot of voices on the right are going to be upset. And security-wise, there wouldn't be a major difference where Israel would maintain security control over part of the West Bank or the entire West Bank. Anyhow, it's really hard to know what's going to happen. We are past the 1st of July when Israel could have taken a step. So who knows what's going to be? There's an extremely sensitive time, not only because of the attitude of the European nations, but also because the upcoming American election. And the party's here. Netanyahu was first enthusiastic. Now he's not enthusiastic. Gantz of the Blue and White Party was never enthusiastic. And maybe Gantz wants a cost-benefit analysis, and maybe he'll figure that partial sovereignty will likely still have the negative consequences with very little gain. So we don't know what's going to happen. It's an extremely sensitive time, and it's sort of nerve-wracking when you really think about it. In the meantime, there's nothing being said now since the 1st of July. We're already into the middle of July, and there's no sign that our government is going to take any step. So these are very, very interesting times. I'll be back after the break.
Leap of Faith with Penina Taylor.
We live in the age of information, but not inspiration. If you're like me, you're looking to be inspired to reach higher, to connect more, and to grow. Well, if you want to get warm, you need to stand close to the fire. And if you want to catch fire, you need to stand close enough to get hit by the sparks. Join me, Penina Taylor, as we walk with people who have embarked on a spiritual journey towards Torah. We'll uncover what started them on their journey and what truths they discovered along the way. So prepare to be inspired as we take a leap of faith every Sunday at 5 p.m. on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I want to say a few general words about annexation. Up until the 1st of July, we were talking here in Israel as though annexation was going to take place in the Jordan Valley on the 1st of July. About a week before the 1st of July, the government stopped talking about annexation, and since then, we're already into the middle of month of July. You don't hear anything about it. What is this all about? There was a possibility of a unilateral annexation, which runs the risk of sparking a diplomatic crisis with numerous countries, and many of those countries, like Jordan and parts of Europe, have already hinted as much. U.S. members of Congress are also watching closely. So all of a sudden, it seems to be off the agenda. For Israel, the current discussion about annexation and U.S. President Trump's peace plan appear more focused on the short-term domestic political gain associated with the coalition than they do about the historic choice that changes more than 50 years of Israeli policy. But annexation cannot stand on its own. And the Trump plan, for example, it is part of that plan. One which includes the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, joint industrial zones, and other parameters critical for any future peaceful resolution. The truth of the matter is that Israel must lay out a national security strategy and explain what it is seeking to accomplish in the so-called West Bank. Annexing parts of the West Bank, whether just a few settlements or up to 30% of it, seems to be the plan we hear about, whether in the Jordan Valley or in Gush Etzion south of Jerusalem. It must be done as part of a strategy, not just as an ad hoc approach. Israel has extended its laws to territory conquered during war in the past. It did so in Jerusalem after the Six-Day War, which is 53 years ago, and in 1981 when Menachem Begin applied Israeli law to the Golan Heights, taking responsibility for providing residency in Jerusalem and citizenship in the Golan. I've mentioned this before, and I'm sure the listeners are aware of this. Yet, in the West Bank, Israel has never really decided what it wants to do, and instead has preferred a policy vacuum that lacks any clarity. Now, while the right-wing camp claims Israel has a right to the West Bank, that was determined by European powers in San Remo back in the early 1920s, or other meetings during and after the First World War, this runs up against similar assertions on the left that Israel is illegally occupying the West Bank and the Palestinians deserve a state. So that's an argument between the right and the left here in Israel. Now, Israel does not have a simple way to square the circle on this. Instead, it engaged in the discussions that led to the Oslo Accords in the 1990s and got the U.S. to sign on to support this plan. There was the White River Agreement and the negotiations 20 years ago at Camp David. Not all of these plans worked, just like there was a Rogers Plan, remember, the Allon Plan. They never came to fruition. Clearly, the peace process and various plans are filled with Israel's history like litter, going back to the 1930s Peel Commission and various maps drawn up by the British. Turns out when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, maps are easy to draw, but making historic decisions is not. Israel has said that it is committed to the two-state solution, and many allies fear that walking away from that will erode Israel as a democratic state. Those of us in Israel who realize that there is no two-state solution because the Arabs don't want one, we're not worried about Israel becoming or losing its position as a democratic state. Except for the United States, few countries support or will accept annexation. That's the way it is, whether they're right or whether they're wrong. In past decades, the United Nations declared that Zionism was racism, and America would constantly pressure Israel over all kind of little details, such as the building of a home or the initial approval of future homes in eastern Jerusalem. I think we can honestly say that gone are the days when there was such an avalanche of attention. This has been replaced by a Middle East that concentrates on Iran, Syria, Libya, and other crises. But annexation would cause a break with the Kingdom of Jordan, which has been angry at Israel's behavior for more than a decade. Jerusalem has done little to placate Amman or even tried to work with the Jordanians. The peace with Jordanians on our eastern border was considered a model, but it may indeed be thin. You have to remember the king of Jordan, I think, that he relies on Israel for defense. He would have been knocked. His grandfather, King Hussein, would have been knocked off by the Palestinian terrorists back in 1970 when they revolted against him. That was something you can check out in the history books. The terrorists ran away from Jordan and came to Israel for safety. So, as I said, maps are easy to draw. So, and the attention now is on the virus more than anything else. So, it may be a good time to annex. The problem with our method of governance, as it is that Israel is often short-sighted. The last 18 months have 3 elections that made Israel look like a chaotic mess and an unstable country. And the coalition is not really a very stable one. Instead of laying out a strategic vision for the future, our prime minister appears to govern by thinking about a short-term gains like annexation without considering a larger resolution to the conflict with the Palestinians. There are many people like me, for example, just typical, do not think there's any resolution with the Palestinians. They even refuse to sit down and talk with Israel. And Israel doesn't appear in their maps and their education system. The little kids from pre-kindergarten up are taught to hate Jews and that Israel has no right to exist. That's perhaps the basic problem here. You may be right. I think that this country needs a vision. An important historic act such as annexation requires a worldview of where Israel is going. It's not just annexation in a vacuum. Annexation has to be part of a plan of where Israel wants to be 10 and 20 years from now. That's what I think. Policymakers may be afraid to say the two-state solution will not happen, although it is very little probability that there will be a two-state solution because the other side simply not only doesn't want it, but doesn't even indoctrinate its citizens about a two-state solution. It doesn't teach its children from pre-kindergarten up about a two-state solution. It's not in their vocabulary. So it could be, as I said, that policymakers may be afraid to say the two-state solution won't happen. Because if you say that, maybe it will jeopardize relations with other countries like in Europe. However, the problem we have now is the leadership of the country essentially refusing to say how their application of sovereignty will mesh with any concept, even a two-state concept. It's time that our government take responsibility and lay out a plan. One of the problems we have now, if not the biggest problem, is our government seems to be pushing day to day to get through. It's a weak, wavering coalition. Nobody wants to have another election because they had 3 in a year and a half, and that's kind of breaking the limit for it. It's laughable already. There are, I think, something like more than 30 ministers in the government. So far, the politicians here and the members of Knesset have been busy worrying about their own futures and what the government is going to look like and who's going to get offices and who's going to get drivers and who's going to get protected and things of that nature, but there is no long plan put forth by the government. There's no unity in the government of what we want to look like 10 and 20 years from now. And that is a major, major deficit it's a failing in how we are being led by our politicians. It's a very serious problem. So in this section of the program, I just wanted to review what's happening with the annexation plan, which somehow has slipped off the table. And as of today, the middle of July, you don't hear anything about it. It was supposed to probably occur the earliest date, the 1st of July. It slipped by, and now it's sort of in limbo. And that is a very bad situation for a government to be leading its citizens. We don't know what is going to happen. Obviously, the coronavirus is a big problem, but it's not the only problem we have. And we should expect our government to provide us with some kind of leadership. I'll be back next week. I hope things will be clearer by then. Jay Shapiro is signing off.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.